Welcome everybody to this Fireside Chat with the team and Matt. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about technology and also about the important role that maintainers have when managing an open source project, a successful open source project. So let's start by doing a quick round of introductions. My name is Marco. I'm the CTO, co-founder of Kong. Matt, do you want to start?
Sure. Happy to be here. Thank you. My name is Matt Klein. I'm a software engineer at Lyft, where I spend my time leading the infrastructure team. And then that's about 50% of my time. And then the other 50% of my time, I work within the CNCF. I'm on the TOC, I'm on the governing board, and I help lead the open source proxy project called Envoy.
And Tim.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Marco. This should be fun. My name is Tim Hinrichs. I'm the CTO and co-founder at Tyra and one of the co-creators of the Open Policy Agent project.
Very well. So let's start by exploring a little bit what were the main drivers that led to the creation of Envoy and OPA.
Who would you like to start?
You can start, Matt.
Okay, sure, yeah. So Envoy started amazingly over 5 years ago now. So prior to Lyft, I had worked at Twitter, and I've worked in the cloud native networking space for over a decade now. So prior to to Lyft, I had worked in edge networking at Twitter, and I'd obviously seen how folks were doing service-to-service networking within that org. And when I came to Lyft, there was a bunch of the common problems that people have when they roll out microservice architectures: trouble with observability, trouble with networking, trouble with reliability. So having previously worked with existing proxies like Nginx and HA proxy and had built an edge proxy proprietary to Twitter, I had an inclination, that we could do something different. And that's where Envoy came from. And actually, just really briefly at Lyft, Envoy originally was not a service mesh proxy. We actually deployed it first as an edge proxy, just to get better observability into all the API calls coming into our system. And then very quickly after that, we ran it on our monolith, so that was our first service-to-service case, started to use it to proxy to MongoDB to, deal with observability and reliability problems there. And then the rest is history. We deployed it everywhere across all services and, to give us the service mesh that we have today.
So is the service mesh at Lyft encompassing every service right now, or are you guys still doing that migration?
Oh no, yeah, it has encompassed every service for years. So we've had a fully deployed service mesh for probably since the beginning of 2017. so over 3 years.
Got it. And I assume you guys built your own control plane.
Well, right. So we made Envoy. So, the control plane built up around Envoy. In the beginning, it was basically bundling static config files with Envoy binaries. And then we built, the initial REST APIs that eventually became XDS. And then we built more REST APIs, and then we built the gRPC APIs and built our internal control plane. So, Lyft is a really interesting case just because we've been running Envoy for longer than anyone, that we're using a lot of features, but we also have a lot of technical debt just because we have done this continuous migration as we've built new features and scaled. Got it.
And what about OPA, Tim? How did you come up with that?
Yep. So before Tyra, I was at VMware, and we were sort of as part of the Nicira acquisition there, and so we just happened to be chatting with a number of like financial and tech customers, and what they had all described was this policy system that they built internally. They built it simply to solve the problem of policy and authorization across many different pieces of software. And so when we started the company at some point, we knew that was a very real problem, certainly in a number of verticals, those that were heavily regulated. And so, what we built in terms of OPA was this general purpose solution to the authorization of the policy problem. The idea, of course, was to make sure that you could have one unified solution to authorization that would work for really any kind of software, you know, in theory at least. And where we started was really the cloud native ecosystem. And that cloud native ecosystem just sort of had a whole bunch of things going on in it that made the authorization and policy problems just more interesting, more pressing, more important than maybe they would have been in, you know, in other kinds of environments. And so, you know, just the dynamicity that you see in cloud technology, right? Servers are spinning up and down at the whim of like software. If you think about all the DevOps folks, suddenly you've got a whole bunch more people that are putting that are in control of production environments, and so somehow you've got to authorize which people can perform which actions, and so on and so forth. So, you know, what we saw in the cloud native ecosystem is that everybody's embracing a whole new swath of technology, a whole new collection of software components. And so when they do that, they still have to put authorization in place. It doesn't go away. It's one of the foundational problems in security. And so, you know, when we built OPA, that was the goal, to give people a single way of solving that authorization problem across all the different software systems within cloud native.
So assuming there is an organization that wants to explore with OPA, obviously they already have lots of different bits and pieces of authorization, authentication spread across the entire org. How would you suggest any organization or team starts adopting OPA, and what do you suggest to avoid in order to not fall into common pitfalls?
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question. I think what a lot of people see and what a lot of people love about OPA is the fact that it can be used across all these different software systems. So like you can use it for Kubernetes admission control and microservice authorization, and a lot of folks use it for Kafka authorization and in CI/CD pipelines. And so people love that vision, the picture that we always show people. They get excited by it. The recommendation we always make, though, is that you need to find one place where you're in pain today, where you absolutely have to solve the authorization problem. And it doesn't really matter where you start. Maybe it's Kubernetes admission control, maybe it's service mesh authorization, but pick one, try it out with OPA, make sure that's working, make sure that you succeed, you know, communicate to security and compliance and engineering and dev and ops, and make sure that everybody's on the same page, that this is a good, viable solution. And then go ahead and think about the broader vision and using it in other areas. So that's certainly, you know, the one piece of advice I'd give to anybody who is looking into OPA.
And as part of your effort with OPA, you also started your own organization, the Tyra, right? Mm-hmm. What does Tyra do that OPA doesn't do?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it sort of goes back to that discussion you had with Matt there a second ago, which was that, you know, OPA is what we think of as the data plane for our authorization, right? You run many copies of OPA as sidecars, just like you would with a network proxy in a service mesh. And so what we do commercially is we have a product that allows you to manage or control all of those OPAs, right? Think of it as the control plane or the management plane, or that, you know, single pane of glass, however you want to think about it, for OPA.
Yeah, speaking of which, if I'm not wrong, people can use the external authentication filter that Envoy provides to integrate, to connect with an OPA agent, if in case they wanted to integrate OPA with Envoy, which is pretty cool. It comes out of the box, actually. And so, Matt, when somebody wants to start using Envoy to process their data in motion, right, either at the edge or in a service mesh, what have you seen working when it comes to adopting Envoy, and what have you seen being common mistakes people make?
Yeah, so I think that Envoy at this point is one of these foundational technologies that is under a lot of other systems that are being built. So I think in that, from that standpoint, Kubernetes and Envoy are somewhat similar. They're being used as these building blocks to build higher layer systems. And because of that, Envoy by its very nature is a very powerful but also very complicated piece of software. And I think from a project perspective, we're always trying to strike this balance of how do we onboard people, right? Like how do we get them to potentially use Envoy in an incremental way, and to try to better understand who is our user base? Is our user base system integrators that tend to have a better understanding of some of these networking concepts, or is our user base, direct end users who are going to use it in a particular deployment like they would Nginx or HA proxy? And the reality is that we have a large mix. And what I would say to people though is that because of Envoy's innate complexity and power, I really encourage people to forget the shiny tech for a second and start with just understanding, what are the business problems, or like what are the problems that are actually trying to be solved, because Envoy does so many things. I mean, from observability to reliability to integration with OPA to auth. I mean, it's like almost endless at this point. And I think it can be overwhelming to users, to decide what parts of the system that they want to use. So my first piece of advice is always forget the giant feature set that Envoy has. Start with a very specific use case, and figure out why Envoy is going to be the best use case for that, and then deploy just that, right? And get some facility with understanding Envoy and operating it. And then, once users take that first step, I think it becomes easier to incrementally add other configurations or pieces of technology. But it's certainly not as easy a journey as I think some people would like. And that's where I think a lot of the system integrators come in. And these days, we see Envoy being used in cloud products, in service meshes, in all types of different verticals. So again, I think it's important for a user to understand what problems are they trying to solve. Should they be using raw Envoy? Should they be using an Envoy powered higher layer ingress controller or service mesh or other type of product? And then probably go from there.
I think this is a wise advice that can possibly apply to other technologies as well.
Oh, sure.
many times. Yeah.
I was just going to say, it's the same advice for both of us. It's like, start small, find something that really matters, solve it, and then go from there. Yeah.
One of the reasons why this has been working well for many folks is it builds up that confidence, not just within themselves, but also with the people and the teams that are affected by this change. If they can go step by step, that confidence requires time to build and to get. And so going little by little, getting those immediate business wins right away helps building that confidence, be it Envoy, be it OPA or Kubernetes, or really any other piece of technology. The pitfall is, if it's not tied to a business use case, then it becomes an academic project. Why are we even doing this and spending time doing this? Yeah. So very, very wise piece of advice. So Tim and Matt, actually, so you both OPA and Envoy are part of CNCF. So Tim, let's start by you. Why did you think that CNCF was the right home for OPA? Why not another foundation?
Well, I think, as I sort of described earlier, one of the things that we knew early on was that the cloud native ecosystem was going to be a place where there's a bunch of technology that could use, authorization and unified authorization more than that. And so for us, the CNCF was a great place, not only technology-wise though, but also in terms of just, you go to a KubeCon and you can just feel the energy, the excitement that people have, and the willingness to go and look and investigate new technologies, right? And when we joined the CNCF, like OPA wasn't a household name, right? So being in an area where donating this to a foundation where a lot of the constituents, the people who cared about that area were really energetic and great to work with was also a big consideration for us. So if you think about the technology match and the community match, it was a pretty easy decision for us.
We're seeing lots of software being adopted in the past 10 years when it comes to open source software. I mean, the world today, when it comes to architecture, when it comes to these kind of things, it's certainly very different than the world, in the early 2000s. And so why do you think, Matt, open source is taking such an important role into defining these new ways of building our architectures?
it's a very interesting topic because if you really want my honest assessment, is that I think source available is mostly around comfort. I think people, like to be able to look under the hood, even though they probably never will, right? It's like most users never modify software. They never patch software. They might file bugs. But I think for many users, it's really just, it's about comfort on two levels. It's about, theoretically, if there's a problem that a vendor won't fix, they can get in there and fix it. And if they, want to look at security aspects or implementation details, it's not a black box. So if you really push me, I think those are the two things that are really driving it. It's not like this virtuous, all software should be free. I mean, that's just not the way that it is. I think it's really around comfort. And so I think we're in a really interesting time right now where open source is not, I would say, what it was 30 years ago, where it tended to be hobbyists. Right now, most of the major open source projects that are used in this space, I mean, they're built by highly paid professional teams, and those teams need to make money, and that's where this becomes very complicated, because we have this two-sided thing where customers want software to be open. Companies who are going to make that software have to figure out how to actually have a business model. And and that's where I think that we've done really well from an Envoy perspective. And I think one of the reasons that Envoy has become so popular is because of this control plane data plane split that we've been talking about, which is that we have competitors that really are trying to sell different products, and they're all built on Envoy, and they compete because we have these open APIs, and they build their own control plane and their own way of managing and their own enterprise services, but we all collaborate on this open source data plane. So I think a lot of it is what I call this loose open core concept of trying to make it where we have the core, the data plane parts be source available, and then have APIs that allow vendors to come in and offer closed source SaaS solutions. So no, I think it's a very interesting time for sure.
So both of you are very active, obviously, in the open source, given your involvement with your projects. What are the untold challenges of being a public open source maintainer? And I know, Matt, that you have some thoughts around the topic, because I saw your tweets every once in a while where you bring this topic up. But let's start with Tim, and then I'll ask you the same question.
Yeah. So yeah, I think one thing that I'm going to say something obvious here, but I'm going to say it because I'm still surprised that it's not more obvious, which is that I see a bunch of folks who, when they are building a new open source project, they sort of talk about it as, I open sourced my code, as if it's done and finished. And I think that what I don't see those same people do is realize that when you start a new open source project, there's a lot of work that goes into, let's call it, community building. But I think more generally, it's just around communication, right? Like, once you get something that sort of works and it's ready, especially if you're at a smaller company, the world does not know or care that thing is open sourced yet. You need to go out and spend quite a bit of time explaining to people what it does, why it matters, and how they can use it. And so certainly, my recommendation would be that if you open source a project, that you're gonna own that open source project for a very long time. You're gonna continue writing code for it, of course. But what you're also going to do for a good amount of time is go out, reach out to customers or users and explain to them what the thing does and why it's useful for them. So, I would even go so far as to say, expect to spend, as much time as you spend writing code as you do talking to and engaging with your users and community more broadly.
Yeah, this is a very valid point. Building out that community that helps the project get better over time. What are your thoughts around this topic, Matt?
I mean, this is a topic that I could literally talk about for hours and hours and hours. So I'm trying to figure out how to summarize it in a in a soundbite. But, you know, I think this comes back to what I was saying before, which is that there's an expectation today that for some of these critical projects that these are mission critical systems. They have super high standards in terms of security and performance and reliability. And who makes these things happen? Highly paid professional programmers and product managers and documentation writers and all these things. So from an open source perspective, where it gets complicated is that, you know, at this point, I like to think of myself as a CEO of a company in which no one actually reports to me. So it's just like controlled anarchy all the time, right? Of like people complaining about this or wanting to do that, you know, and I mean, I barely write any code anymore. It's exactly what Tim was saying. I spent all of my time just trying to stitch together the pieces of like PR, marketing, and documentation, and like security release processes. But the problem is that we haven't figured out as an industry how to pay for this, how to make it sustainable, so that there's people that are doing it that are well compensated, but aren't, you know, doing two jobs, aren't working nights and weekends. And, you know, my work life balance is a lot better than it was. But it's still, you know, I'm an employee of Lyft. It's like I work on Lyft things, you know, yet I think sometimes people think that you know, I am Mr. Envoy and I do this like 100% of my time. So it's just it's a really complicated topic of trying to understand all of the things that goes into making these projects successful. And I think from a community standpoint, it's about building a larger community. It's about, you know, having people have reasonable expectations over what is going to be done, when are things going to get fixed, how they can help actually do those things. So it's a very nuanced topic, and it's something that I think that we really struggle with, and I think we're going to continue to struggle with, because if we have these critical projects, we have to figure out how to, you know, fund the requirements of them across all of the different companies that are actually benefiting. And that's not something that we do today very well. Like even within CNCF, trying to figure out how to get, you know, the funding from the end users and the conferences and all of these things, you know, to the projects is not as easy as it probably should be.
Do you think there is a project that does it right, that could be the inspiration for everybody else, or a company or a project or somebody that does it right?
That's, I think there's probably nothing that does it right, just because it's so hard to get everything 100% right. You know, I look to Linux as a project that has existed for a very long period of time. And again, you know, we have short time here. There's certain things about Linux that I don't like at all. But I think that just from a sustainability perspective, you know, they have scaled that project to a massive level, right? And like, and they've made it work. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from Linux in particular, just because of how long it's been around, how much commercial entity and usage there is. So I think there's a lot to learn there. In the cloud native space, you know, I'm not sure that there's any project that I've seen that, you know, does it right. It's just so complicated from the funding perspective for how fast things move, from frankly the vendor fighting, you know, that goes on. I mean, there's just it's a very fast moving and nuanced and complicated space.
Thank you, Matt. All right, last and final question. Tim, what makes you excited about the future of OPA?
Sure. I mean, I think for me, it's pretty easy. You know, we've sort of talked about how there are all these different use cases for OPA, and you know, I think the thing that always gets me excited is when somebody goes ahead and takes OPA and, you know, solves a new problem with it that I hadn't envisioned. So I always love seeing that kind of creativity from the world at large. And you know, every time I see it, it's always fun, and I'm looking forward to seeing more of it.
And what about you, Matt? What makes you excited about the future of Envoy?
I think there's two things. I think from a tech perspective, I think WebAssembly is one thing that I think is really going to unlock all types of different use cases, from the service mesh case to the edge computing case, just making it easier for people to plug in software into this platform. But I think what I'm most excited about, quite honestly, from the Envoy perspective, is moving to a world in which Envoy really is that building block. It's going to be used almost everywhere, but very few users are going to know that they're using Envoy. It's going to be built into these higher layer systems, whether they be service meshes or API gateways, because I think at the end of the day, software like Kubernetes and Envoy, it's too extensible, it's too complicated, it's not opinionated enough for what most users want to see, which is, passes, faces, those types of things. And I think that this is where cloud vendors and software vendors can come in and build these more opinionated products that use Envoy and Kube, and hopefully provide better value for users.
All right, very well. Well, thank you so much, Tim and Matt. I hope to see you around at Kong Summit, and see you soon.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Marco.